All right, let's jump straight into this explainer. Today, we're breaking down the worldview of Australian One Nation Party leader, Pauline Hanson. Now, we are basing this entirely on an incredibly detailed interview she just gave on TalkTV. Look, whether you agree with her politics or not, you can't deny she is a major force in Australia right now. If you want to understand the shifting political landscape down under, you absolutely have to understand her platform. So we're going to look strictly at the arguments she makes, how she frames her policies, and why exactly she thinks she's resonating so strongly with voters today.
To do that, we're going to tackle this in 5 parts. 1. Pity for the UK. 2. Immigration and economic strain. 3. National identity and culture. 4. The cost of net zero. And 5. One nation's political surge. Let's get to it. Section 1. Pity for the UK.
So she actually doesn't open her platform with domestic policy, which is interesting. She kicks things off with a really provocative cultural comparison. She says, and I quote, "I pity Britain. I just don't want Australia to become the way that Britain has." Looking from the outside in, she's practically terrified that Australia is walking down that exact same path, maybe just a few years behind.
Basically, for the One Nation leader, the UK is the ultimate cautionary tale. She paints this picture of a country totally overwhelmed by mass migration, where people have just lost their sense of national identity and where things like Sharia law are starting to override traditional British culture. On the flip side, she sees Australia as a place that still has, well, a little bit of time left on the clock to protect its values. But she argues they absolutely must demand loyalty from migrants and shut those borders tight before they hit what she sees as the UK's point of no return.
All right, moving on to Section 2, Immigration and Economic Strain.
So what does this actually look like for the domestic economy? Well, Hanson drops a staggering number here, 740,000. She says that between 2022 and 2023, Australia brought in 740,000 migrants. Just to put that into perspective, according to her, that is the highest immigration level the country has seen in 100 years. She argues that kind of influx is totally unprecedented and, more importantly, just flat out unsustainable.
And she claims the economic fallout from this is severe. Take the national debt, for example. She points out it's hitting $1 trillion. That is $50 billion a year just going to interest payments. But where she really hammers her populist argument home is housing. I mean, historically, you could buy a house for maybe 3 times your salary, right? Well, she says now, it takes 14 to 15 times your salary, with median house prices blowing past $1 million. And get this, she points out Australia was supposed to hit a population of 26.4 million by 2050, but they hit 28 million already, a full 24 years ahead of schedule. She argues this crazy, rapid growth is basically a trick, a tactic by the political establishment to artificially pump up the GDP, cooking the books basically, while causing a massive housing and cost of living crisis for everyday folks.
And the crucial point she makes here is how all this stuff snowballs. She claims foreign investment in housing and farmland is just out of control. She brings up that 4.8 million people are sitting on permanent visas and over 100,000 have overstayed. On top of that, she argues that international workers and students are draining something like $10 to $15 billion out of the country every single year. So in her view, mass legal migration and foreign money are literally pricing young Australians entirely out of their own future.
Okay, Section 3, National Identity and Culture.
Now, stepping away from the economic spreadsheets for a second, Hanson leans really heavily into what she sees as the erosion of Australian culture. She points directly to the recent defeat of the voice to Parliament. If you aren't familiar, she describes this as a proposed separate Aboriginal Parliament meant to review legislation. Ultimately, more than 60% of the public voted no, and for Hanson, this wasn't just a lost bill. It was proof, hard evidence that everyday Australians actually want a unified, single national identity, and they firmly reject policies that she claims just divide the nation by race.
And that really captures the vibe of her broader anti-woke platform. She is fiercely opposed to Sharia law, flat out calling it incompatible with the Australian way of life. She completely rejects modern woke ideology in public institutions, especially in schools. For instance, she goes after childcare centers that she claims are out there telling 4-year-olds they can choose their gender. She's absolutely adamant that there are only 2 biological sexes, and she doesn't hold back in criticizing the country's sex discrimination commissioner for refusing to officially define male and female.
Now, as you can imagine, she gets a ton of heat for these stances. People call her extreme, far-right, Islamophobic. But she pushes back hard. She states quite clearly,
Criticism is not racism to raise issues about immigration. The impact it's having on the country is not racism. She really tries to frame herself simply as a patriotic, pragmatic Australian who is stepping up to bat for the nation's culture when the establishment won't.
Section 4. The cost of net zero.
What's super fascinating here is how she takes that exact same populist energy and points it straight at global climate policy. Get ready for another massive number, 300%. She claims that electricity bills in Australia have absolutely skyrocketed by 300% over the last 10 years. And guess who she blames? She places it squarely, 100% on net zero climate mandates.
In fact, she outright rejects global climate change mitigation. She just says, it's got nothing to do about changing the climate. We cannot change the climate. Her core argument here is that since Australia only accounts for about 1% of global emissions, domestic policies to cut those emissions are practically pointless on a global scale, but completely financially destructive on a local scale.
To back this up, she runs through the collateral damage. She claims over 1,400 manufacturing industries have vanished, 40,000 small businesses shut down entirely. She points out that 45% of small businesses are stressed out of their minds just trying to pay their power bills, and elderly pensioners literally can't afford to turn on the heater or the AC. In her narrative, the establishment's obsession with these climate goals is the direct cause of the brutal cost of living crisis crushing everyday citizens right now.
Finally, Section 5. One nation's political surge.
So what does this all mean at the ballot box? Is anyone actually buying it? Well, according to Hanson, absolutely. She points to some upcoming by-election polling to prove her party is on fire. These numbers show One Nation polling in the low 30s. That is significantly outperforming the traditional conservative coalition, which is sitting at 20, and the National Party way down at 10. She says, look, we aren't just taking conservative votes anymore. We're pulling frustrated voters straight from the left-leaning Labour Party, too. She claims they are effectively cannibalizing both sides of the political establishment. And when you trace her career, you really see her staying power. 30 years ago, she was first elected to the Australian Parliament. In 2003, she spent 11 weeks in a maximum security prison, a stint she blames totally on the political maneuvering of former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. She even calls herself Australia's first political prisoner. Fast forward to recent national elections, and she claims One Nation's national vote surged all the way to 28%, up from just 6.5%. She really portrays herself as the ultimate survivor, someone who faced intense political persecution and is finally getting massive mainstream vindication.
And here's an interesting shift. She notes her base is actually changing. It's becoming surprisingly multi-ethnic. She draws a direct parallel between her movement and Nigel Farage's Reform UK party, saying that voters from all different backgrounds come up to her, sometimes in tears, saying, "Keep going, please, don't give up, you're our last hope." She sees herself as the absolute last line of defense for the working class against a totally disconnected elite.
So, having unpacked all this source material, here's the big question we're left with. As politics continue to fracture all over the West, we really have to ask, will Pauline Hanson's surging momentum actually permanently disrupt the Australian political establishment? Or is this just a temporary symptom of some very deep economic and cultural frustration? Ultimately, the voters are going to have to answer that one. But one thing is for sure, her platform is striking a massive chord right now. Thanks so much for walking through this explainer with me. Keep questioning everything, and I'll see you on the next one.